So one of the bits of code we wrote a couple of episodes ago that I said we'd come back to was what happens when we fetched a followed user. So we fetched them when we had their ID, and we need to now put that data into our list of followed users. And this is the part of the model update that does it. So you can see we take our list.map of following users, which remember is a list of followed users who have an ID and data. And if we have that and we fetch the new data, we put the new data in here, else we do nothing. This code is quite hard to understand. It's also quite big and taking up quite a lot of room, and we have a lot of code here too. So what we want to do today is pull some of this out into its own module. So I'm going to actually open up a split and create a new file relative to the current view, and let's call it followed users. What should we call it? Fetching. I guess we're dealing mostly with fetching these users. So let's get fetching followed users.elm. Fetching followed users. We'll just expose everything for now. And what I'm going to do is going to grab this big case here from the let and just come right down to, oh my word, it's quite hard with this small resolution for the purpose of the screencast. Let's grab all of that, put it in here, and then for now I'm just going to close main.elm so we've got a bit more room to work with. So let's create a function, and we're going to call this update followed user with data. So what we're going to do here is we'll hopefully have this user data, and we're also going to need that ID as well. So we're going to take an ID, a user ID, and an actual user that we've just fetched, and then we're going to take the list of followed users. So we'll say list followed user, and we're going to return a new list of followed user. So this is going to take the user ID, or let's say new user data ID. Or let's just call it new user ID. I think that's clear enough. We're going to take the new user data, and we're going to take the following list. I'll just call that following. And so for now we can get this working by just returning following, or by working, I mean at least compiling. Some of this code we're not going to need, so we don't need to worry about the new status. We don't need to worry about creating the new user either. We're just worrying about the actual following part here. Okay, and we're getting some errors on the types, so let's import types. Supposing ... we should get rid of those. So let's go into our main.elm and we'll use this function. So we'll import fetching followed users. I'm not going to expose the function here. So in our model, we can replace this new following with fetching followed users dot, what do I call it? Update followed user with data, and it's going to take the new user ID. So this is followed user dot ID. In fact, because it's ID, we can just rather than pass in .id and then pass in the actual data like that, which really is just passing the same thing twice, we can just pass it once. So we'll update our definition in a minute. And we also need to take the we need to take the actual list of followed. So this is logged in user.following. Great, and let's delete all this. So this is already looking much cleaner. If we go in here, we can update our type. So we're not going to take a user ID, we're just going to take a user. So you can see already that this is cleared up. Just moving the code out has left our update code much more easy to read. We update our following list, we update the user, and we update the auth status with that new user. As a general rule, you want to keep your update functions and the branches in the case quite short. The update function itself might be quite long with lots of cases, but the actual body of these cases should be hopefully fairly small. So let's actually get this properly working. So we're going to basically grab this list.map and bump it in there and remove that comment and hit save, and we're going to get some issues here. User ID is equal, we don't have defined in here at the moment. This logged in user.following is simply following, and what I'm actually going to do is pull that up to the top. That's our list, and we'll pipe that through to list.map. This followed user here is what's actually new user data up here, but I think followed user is a better name, so we'll say followed user. So now all we need to know is if user IDs are equal. What I'm actually going to do is find that function, user IDs equal, and I'm going to take it and I'm going to put it for now in our types file, because I think it is related to the types. It's taking a type and actually giving us some extra information about it. I'm going to expose that function as well. So now I've deleted it from main, and we now have it available here. So let's just clear up the rest of this file. And let's go make sure in our view that we're still listing our followed users correctly. And you can see that we are, and we still have the name Jan Smith displayed there. So just by pulling this out into a new function, it's already made our main much clearer. And I think we've done a nice job of just pulling out some of the logic around following users and putting it into this one place. If we go into api.elm, we can also see a bunch of logic here, like fetch followed users for user, which probably belongs in our fetching followed users module. It's code very much related to fetching followed users, so rather than it being in a generic api.elm, I think we'd be well within reason to pull it into this function. So if we scroll up here, we're going to leave the decoder here. The followed user decoder could also come with us. And again, this handle fetch user request is actually really handle fetching a followed user request, so that could come with us too. So let's look at pulling all this out. So let's start with fetch followed users for user. I'm going to pull that out of there, and we're just going to paste it down in here. And we'll update this exposing to expose fetch followed users for user. So we're going to get an error that we don't have the fetch user function. That fetch user function is coming from api.elm, which we expose, which rather we don't expose, but we will now expose fetch user. So in here we can import API, come down and swap fetch user for api.fetchUser. Now what we need to do is just find where we call this fetch followed users for user and actually just replace it. So we'll search for fetch followed users for user. And it's just in main.elm. So we can swap this from being api.fetchFollowedUsers to user called fetching followed users. And now that we have this in a module called fetching followed users, I don't think we need to call the function this. I think we can literally just call it fetch, because we don't need to say all the followed users bit again. We can just say fetch and it will be more obvious what's going on, else we're just making ourselves have to type more. So I'll swap out all those occurrences. And let's go and check in the browser that this is still working. And you can see it's all good, and we're still listing everything correctly. The final thing I want to do is make this fetch user function a bit more generic. Right now it always uses the handle fetch user request function that tells it what to deal with and which message to send. But right now we're always sending a fetch followed user request. What I'd rather fetch user do is actually take this handler function so we can pass it in when we call it. So we're going to update fetch user to take a token, a user ID, and then what I'll call a handler function. And this will take a result that's an http.error if it's errored, or a user, and should return a message. So we'll say token user ID and we'll say handler func. So we'll change the send here to be handler func. This is going to break a bunch of things, firstly because I've messed up my type annotation. So now this handle fetch user request, let's grab that, and we're going to put this into our fetch following users. So we're going to say handle fetch users result. And so now in our fetch code, we're going to call api.fetchUser. We're going to give it the token and the user ID and our handle fetch users result. And we get an error here that we're not importing the HTTP module, so let's import that. Okay, I think this is looking good. Let's go back into api.elm, and I think we're looking good here as well. So now we're in a really nice place. We've ended up with a really generic fetch user function that we can use now whenever we need to fetch users. You'll notice that we don't use it for the fetch authenticated user. The fetch authenticated user function is a bit different. It doesn't take user ID, it uses the user that's logged in and hits a special endpoint. We could refactor that to use the more generic fetch user function, but for now I think I'm happy with this slight bit of duplication. There's one more thing I'd like to do, and it's make this code a little bit more clear. So we have the following users. We then have to do a bit of kind of jumping through update hoops to get the data right. We have to update our new user with their new following, and we then have to update the status. It would be handy if we had functions that let us do this more easily. So we should be able to say something like new status equals update user, and that will take a function that will take the current user, the current logged in user, and we can do things like say user where following equals new following. And this should also do the work of just wrapping this user in our logged in for us, which it's currently not doing. So to do that, it will need to take, let's say, model.auth. And so I want to be able to effectively write the code that makes this work. And to do this, we can just define our update user function inline for now before we pull it out. So we'll say update user. It's going to take an authentication status, and it's going to take a function that takes what does it take? It takes an actual user and returns a user. And then it overall is going to return an authentication status. So don't be afraid to define functions inline in a let. You can still use type annotations if you just want to play around with them. So say auth status, a user mapper equals. So in here we can go into another let block. We can say let new user equals user mapper, or rather we need to do a case statement first because we need to make sure that the authentication status is logged in. So we'll say case auth status of, and if it's logged in with a token and a user, then we can do our work. Else what we'll do is we'll just kind of bail out at this point and just return the existing auth status. So if a user isn't logged in, we won't do any transformation on them because we don't have one to transform. So in here I can say let new user equals user mapper user. And that's effectively this bit down here that we were doing. And then we need to create the new status. So I'll say in logged in token new user. Hit save, that goes out. We get an error here. What are we erroring on? The name token is first defined. So this is shadowing, saying here we've already destructured here, so we don't need to do it in here. So this logged in can become, let's just call this user token, like so. And then we can update our status using that function. And let's go and see that we haven't got any compiler errors. You can see we haven't got any errors and everything is running correctly. So finally, let's actually pull this out into its own function. So I'll grab this update user here. Oops, I was a bit overzealous with my cutting. Let's grab that bit there. And let's just put it into here for now. I don't think this is where it makes sense for it to live long term, but for now this is fine. When you're not quite sure where something needs to go, just leave it in the current file until you have a better idea. So we'll save that. And in our update here, we now can create our new following users. We update our status, and then we put it into our model. So now this code is much more cleaner. We also have a handy function called update user, which we can pass it a function that will do the actual data transformation on our user, but it will deal with wrapping it up in the logged in authentication status for us. And now we don't have to worry about that every time we want to update a user.